The sign said, "Chapel Perilous. Price of admission, your mind. S. Muss Sign, Proprietor." Dashwood passed through the lavatory into the laboratory, where Patrick Knowles and Lon Chaney were turning switches and throwing relays wildly, as Bela Lugosi, with Karloff's old makeup, tried to pretend he was the Frankenstein monster, while Ilona Massey huddled in a corner looking worried. It seemed that some refurbishing and rebuilding had been going on in the downtown area, for Union Square was much bigger than Dashwood remembered, and there were several new buildings surrounding it. Most of them built in hyperbolic and non-Euclidean curves. Chinatown was now facing directly onto the square instead of being 2 blocks downhill and to the right. But there was a huge sign on Chinatown Gate saying, "Closed for alterations. Fu Manchu, Proprietor." Claude Shannon of Bell Laboratories and Tristan Zara, the pioneer Dadaist, were picking random words out of people's mouths as they passed and gluing them to a huge billboard where they had already formed the pseudo-sentence, "American life bomb went authoritarian in frontal attack on an English author." "We're discovering the information redundance ratio in random signals," Shannon explained, waving a programmable calculator. "And we're creating a new art form," Zara shouted. The 10 Woodsmen of Oz went by with some of the boys from the heavy metal mob. There were only 2 doors leading back out to the Bureau of Common Sense. One had a picture of Christ on the cross and bore the legend, "Love one another." The other had a picture of Captain Ahab and bore the legend, "I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." "Do I have to make a choice?" Babbitt asked. All this was going by too fast for him. One minute he was driving home from break and past the billboard on Howard Street with the eye on the pyramid, and the next minute he was in this place. The lights began to go out all over San Francisco, first in 1s and 2s, then in dozens and scores, and then in hundreds, until a Stygian blackness descended in which punk rock groups and transvestites could be seen dimly as they marched in robot hordes toward the bay. "UFOs over the power station," somebody shouted, "a major blackout." And behind the gate of Chinatown, the drums of Fu Manchu began. The punk rock groups led the parade downhill through Chinatown to the ocean. Turn back, screamed an effete intellectual snob. "The sea is not our home. Beware of the rising rivers of blood. Beware of the robot animal within. Turn back, turn back." But the punkers marched, and everybody fell in step behind them. First came the lewds and the creepers, then the dirks and the blunt instruments. Then more and more, the problem of anxiety, the daggers, the funny farm, the noon's repose, and the troubled midnight. And now it was not separate trickles with one huge rushing stream. The leapers, the laughing academy, the Foamix culprits, the mail cover, Dr. Terror's house of ill repute, the keyhole peepers, the wiretappers, the whoopee casket company, and over the shrieks and howls of their music from deep inside the hidden recesses of Chinatown, the drums of Fu Manchu grew louder, and more were coming still. Dashwood recognized the muggers, the synthesizers, Moses and monotheism, reefer madness, Crazy Artie's Crisis Intervention Center, the Junior College of Cardinals, Totem and Taboo, the Things on the Doorstep, the Hoods, the Lanovacs, Six Flags over the Vatican, the Sleepers, the Beepers, the Roofers, the Cokers, the Thundering Hoofs, the Framistan, the Power to Cloud Men's Minds, and the Croakers. Pickering's moon circled the earth going backward. And still the punks came, the chocolate mouse, the tax write-off, the welfare bums, the primal scream, Baphomet's witnesses, the black rabbit of inlay, the vegetables, the fruits, the nuts, the first church of Satan scientists, the Tantric Presbyterians, the Huns, the creatures from the backward, the special children, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the looters, the shooters, the scooters, the peanut butter conspiracy, the Thousand Kim, the seeds of discord, the Benton Harbor rat weasel, the bloodshot pyramid, the Wasco Wabbits, Crescendo, the diabolic variations, Skinner Ball, the Committee for the Elimination of Death, the weird-made flesh, the poor golems, the wretched refuse, the aluminum Bavariati, the double helix, the goons, the thugs, the teeming shore, the unnatural act, the solitary vice, the morose delectation, the wrist slashers, the window jumpers, the kryptonite kids, the stay-free mini-pads, the elect Cohens, the corpse eaters of Lang, the miniature sled, the hash brownies, the Boston blackies, Cadath and the cold lace, the Neanderthal tales, the giant slugs, the sloths, the disadvantaged youth, the Albert DeSalvo fan club, the dead Kennedys, the Molotov cocktails, and loudest and most eldritch of all, great Cthulhu's starry wisdom band. And overall, there was a smell of fried onions. Hey, I like that.
That's from Schrodinger's Cat, the trilogy, the third book.
Are we on?
Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, you can introduce me now. That was Robert Wilson
reading from Schrodinger's Cat trilogy. That was the third book. Is that correct? The Homing Pigeons?
Yeah, it's the third book of the Schrodinger's Cat trilogy.
You've been described, I think, and you've referred to yourself sometimes as a guerrilla ontologist. Could you explain what that means?
Well, I think the passage I just read sort of explains guerrilla ontology. You don't know where you are or what the laws are of that. A few pages back, you were in a quite ordinary universe, San Francisco in the 1980s. Everything was perfectly normal. And then suddenly Dr. Dashwood jumped out a window and found himself in this universe. My books are sort of structured that way. I feel that reality is not something we know, but a series of guesses we make. And in my books, the reader never knows from one page to another how much is real and how much is a put on, and where the fiction ends and the facts begin, or where the facts end and the fiction begins. I call it guerrilla ontology, but then I discovered it sort of was invented in France independently of me and is called deconstructionism.
There are a number of characters that run through a number of your works that are possibly obscure to someone unfamiliar with your writings or just discovering them for the first time. Some appear to be historical figures, while others give the impression that they were fictionally created. Could you elaborate on the origins or inspirations for some of the characters? Hagbard, Celine, Markov, Cheney.
Hagbard Celine is totally fictitious. He was created as a kind of ideal Nietzschean pirate hero. Markov Cheney was inspired by my study of mathematical information theory, in which the Markov chain plays a very important part. That's a mathematical function. And thinking about the Markov chain, I started thinking of Lon Chaney and Lon Chaney Jr., and if there was a third, he might be Markov Chaney, named after the Markov chain. And then I was in a store on North Clark Street in Chicago, where I was living at the time, and I saw a sign that said, no employee may punch the time card for any other employee. Any deviation will result in termination. The awkward rhyme there seemed so funny to me, and it also seemed to me to sum up the whole structure of our civilization, which is so totally authoritarian and yet pretends to be a democratic, free market, open society. And yet, this sums up our everything in America is really under that law. Any deviation will result in termination. So I thought that summed up our whole country, and it was signed the MGT, the MGT, the MUCT, which presumably was supposed to stand for the management, I decided it could just as well stand for the midget. So I invented Mark Goff Cheney, who was a midget and went around putting up signs so idiotic that they were a caricature of our civilization, but so close to the real thing that everybody would take them as the real thing. And I imagine that he put that sign in that store. He's the one who's arranged that when the light flashes red, the hand sign goes green and leaves you confused. And when the light goes green, the hand sign is red. He's an electronics genius. Anyway, he's developed quite a bit after I originally imagined him. He was a virgin through 4 of my books. I finally let him achieve union with a woman in my 6th novel. And I'm sorry I did. I think he was meaner when he was still a virgin.
Hassan Sabah?
Hassani Sabah. He was a real historical character. He was the founder of the Ismailian sect of Islam, generally known as the Assassins. Some say after his name. Some say assassin derives from his name, Hassan. Others say it derives from hashish, of which he was inordinately fond. He invented the slogan, which I think is one of the most liberating mantras in the history of this planet: nothing is true, all is permissible. According to his biographer, he said that on his deathbed, and his soul immediately plunged to hell. Well, that's the way Orthodox Muslims think, but from a Sufi point of view, Hassan makes a lot of sense. Nothing is true, all is permissible. I have him walking with a lurching gait in all of my novels in honor of a Greek physician who testified before Congress that marijuana should be illegal because people who smoke too much of it begin to spend all their time discussing philosophy, and they walk with a lurching gait. That's why George Washington walks with a lurching gait in all of my novels, too.
What was the inspiration for Dr. Dashwood?
Now, Dr. Dashwood is a fictitious character, but I took his name from a very controversial British politician of the 18th century, Sir Francis Dashwood. Ran an institute of higher learning called the Abbey of St. Francis, which was named not after St. Francis of Assisi, but after Francis himself, Francis Dashwood. He named it after himself and canonized himself. And what went on there was described by the sensational tabloids, which were just starting at that time, as black masses and all sorts of blasphemies. They nicknamed it the Hellfire Club. Actually, it was an attempt to revive paganism. Benjamin Franklin was a member, and he and Dashwood collaborated on the Book of Common Prayer, right on the grounds of the Abbey of St. Francis. But Francis Dashwood in my books is a post-Masters and Johnson sex researcher who just happens to be descended from the original Francis Dashwood.
There's a scene in the first book, The Universe Next Door. Well, it starts out with Epicene Wilderblood, who later undergoes a sex change operation and becomes Mary Margaret Wilderblood. And then the Ithophalic Eidolon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Eidolon.
Could you kind of go into that, maybe for the...
Well, yeah, Schrodinger's cat, as well as being a popular introduction to quantum mechanics, it's also a deliberate parody of the Odyssey. After Wilderblood has his penis surgically removed, I follow it around the planet. It gets stolen from the hospital, and it wanders around the planet from place to... It circumnavigates the whole globe in the course of the novel, and it parallels the adventures of Odysseus in the Odyssey, which I kind of hinted at in having Wilderblood call it Ulysses. But actually, that's because of its Greek proclivities and its tendency to invade dark, forbidden places. But Wilderblood, actually, the reason he had it cut off and got female hormones and all was he couldn't stand anymore the horror of being male in modern American society, where men are regarded as the lowest form of life, even lower than the animals. I think I was way ahead of my time. That turned out to be a major theme I wrote this book back in '79, still in print, by the way. The Silence of the Lambs has a very similar theme. There's a lunatic in that book who's trying to become a woman by getting female skins and putting them over his own skin. I think a lot of a lot of the politically correct male intellectuals around here are doing a variation on that without cutting off their wang or stealing women's skins. They wrap themselves up in the craziest kind of radical feminist rhetoric so that they sort of pass as females on the verbal level. They're trying to escape their masculinity every way possible. You walk around Santa Cruz, Watsonville, Capitola, around here, the young guys all look like they're doing everything they can think of in their dress, their walk, their speech, to convince people that they're not really male. And so I think my picture of Wilderblood was about 10 years ahead of its time.
At one point in the narrative, it ends up on a sex machine in Dr. Dashwood's laboratory. And then there's a female rock singer that's used in their main experiments. There was a machine.
Yes, this machine really exists. It was invented by Masters and Johnson. I just imagined a little more humorous use of it than Masters and Johnson ever admitted in their published works.
Throughout your works, there's a phrase, chapel perilous. What's the origin of that? Where did that come from?
Chapel Perilous comes from the Grail legend. Parsifal, in his search for the Holy Grail, at one point wandered into Chapel Perilous, where all the normal laws are reversed. It's sort of like falling into a mythological black hole. And I don't know where I picked this up from Aleister Crowley or somebody else, but there are certain stages in the practice of practical occultism in which you find yourself in Chapel Perilous. And unless you have a very good background in skepticism, scientific method, and general philosophy, you're apt to go pretty wacko. But that isn't too bad, because you'll probably make a lot of money on the New Age circuit in that case. But if you want to remain sane, it's best not to go into that kind of experimentation without a lot of background. There was one stage, for instance, in which I was a channeler, and I went to a couple of psychic readers to get opinions about what I was doing. And one said I was channeling ancient Chinese philosopher. Another said I was channeling a medieval Irish bard. I tried to find out from the entity itself, and it told me it was from a planet in the system of the star Sirius. Eventually I decided it was my own right brain I was learning to activate. That's a more conservative theory than any of the others, and I believe it or pretend to believe it most of the time. Actually, I don't know what the hell I was channeling, to tell you the truth, but I like the right brain model because it sounds less extravagant than the others. But if I just went with that, I could set myself up in shop and channel an ancient Chinese philosopher and get a lot of disciples and make a lot of money and get as rich as Jay-Z Knight. But I'm too skeptical to believe in such things literally.
On page 72 in Cosmic Trigger Volume 1, it goes through a list of qualifications or qualities or prerequisites to attempting some of Crowley's more advanced rituals. This seems to tie in line with some of the things I've heard about. You have to really go through a period of purification during some rituals for 100 days of no sexual activity or drugs or alcohol or things like that. Is that kind of along the same lines, besides being grounded in philosophy and in the major sciences?
Well, it depends on which school of magic you're following. I think the most important rules are the ones Crowley gives. You should know a lot of general science and general philosophy and be competent in knowing how to perform experiments and record results. And Israel Rigardi, who was Crowley's secretary back in the 20s and later a successful psychotherapist in Hollywood, Rigardi added 2 more rules. You should go through some form of psychotherapy before you start any occult practices, and you should also study general semantics, which teaches you how not to get your categories mixed up and how to think without the words hypnotizing you. When you get involved in dealing with different levels of consciousness, you tend to call them entities and think they're separate from you. And then you start arguing about what the entities really are, and pretty soon you're in a totally cuckoo system unless you have some training in general semantics. And remember that the map is not the territory, the model you make up is not the experience. And all you really know is what you've been doing to your own brain, which is changing the way your brain functions. And it needs, if you're going to fool around with changing how your brain functions, it needs a lot of skepticism and a lot of scientific training or for general philosophy, because otherwise you're just going to believe all sorts of nonsense. Once you find that there's more than one kind of reality, it's very easy to pick out one of the alternatives, claim it's the real reality, and start a new religion. Then you become a center of pestilence, like most of the founders of the world's great religions.
In Cosmic Trigger 1 and Cosmic Trigger 2, you touch on Dr. Wilhelm Reich. I'm not very familiar with Wilhelm Reich, other than what I've read in Cosmic Trigger 1 and 2. Could you maybe discuss some of your thoughts on Wilhelm Reich?
Yes, back in '57, when the United States government read all of Dr. Reich's books, I got very excited and curious because I don't approve of burning books, especially not scientific books. I thought there was something dreadfully wrong there. So I started trying to get my hands on Reich's books, which was quite a struggle in those days. I got to read a few of them. People wouldn't let me take them out of their apartments. I could sit in their living room and read the books, but I couldn't take them home overnight. And then about 10 years later, the government released the ban, and they allowed Farrar Straus to start republishing Reich's books, a few at a time. Although there are still a couple that are still out of print. And to me, it was a question of civil liberties. And also, civil liberties. You don't burn books, not in a democratic society. Then there was the question: was he right about some of the theories that were so generally condemned? And I met a lot of people who repeated Reich's experiments. I tried, but I didn't want to insist on the accuracy of my results because I don't have a degree in any of the requisite sciences, and I could be a terrible bungler. But more things have been happening over the years. A member of the French Scientific Academy duplicated one of Reich's basic experiments successfully, and more recently at a German university there was a strict double-blind study of the orgone accumulator in which nobody knew which of the subjects was sitting in orgone accumulators and which was sitting in ordinary boxes. And yet the ones in the orgone accumulators did report the tingling and prickling sensations that Reich said they should. And there was no possibility of suggestion there. It was strict double-blind. And there's been actually over 400 papers by heretics who dared to repeat Reich's experiments, and they all support him. The people who know he was wrong say it's a waste of time to repeat experiments and such nonsense. So the only experiments we get by the people are by the people who don't know for sure that he was wrong, the open-minded people, so they're called dupes. You see, once an idea is condemned, if you have an open mind about it, you're a dupe. Only if you have a totally closed mind and believe the people who declare that they are the experts, then you're not a dupe and you won't repeat the experiments. Now, to me, that's totally crazy semantics. I'm still not 100% convinced that Reich was right about everything, but I think the more he gets tested, the more he tends to look like he was right. I begin to think of him like Semmelweis and Pasteur and Galileo and a lot of others who were condemned by the scientific establishment of their time and turned out to be basically right.
In Cosmic Trigger 2, I think there was a chapter on where you underwent Reichian therapy.
Yes.
And what did that entail? And I think there was you mentioned the orgone box.
Well, when I underwent Reichian therapy back in the late 50s, they were very nervous about using the orgone box anymore. But the government had not condemned Reich's body work, which Reich combined muscle relaxation techniques with Freudian analysis, and his own switch on Freudian analysis, which is called character analysis, which basically gets you over and over to confront your own defenses against your own feelings. And together with relaxing the muscles, this produces tremendous outbursts of emotion in which you experience shocking rage and anger and tears and attempts to attack the therapist sometimes. It unleashes power. It's dangerous stuff, which is why Reich was very careful. He didn't believe anybody should be allowed to practice it who wasn't an MD. I don't think MDs are all that sacred. I think people who are an MDs can safely practice it, but they need a lot of training. But anyway, occasionally my therapist used an orgone box, but only after I was in therapy quite a while, and he realized he could trust me. He says, "Remember, never tell anybody from the AMA about this. You don't want me to lose my license, do you?" It was just like the Holy Inquisition, like people with telescopes. You can look through it, but don't tell the Inquisition I own one of these things.
Have they rescinded the restrictions on this, on some of this?
No, the government has never officially abandoned it, but there are more and more people publishing work they've done. But it's a shady area. Nobody knows when they're going to crack down again. There's a fellow up in El Cerrito who has done a certain amount of weather control work and using Reichian devices, and he would like to try bigger experiments, but he's afraid to attract too much attention because the government might just smash his equipment with axes like they smashed Reich's equipment and throw him in jail. Governments hate to admit they ever made a mistake. You know, this reminds me of the Dreyfus case in France. Dreyfus was an army officer who got convicted of passing papers to the secret documents to the Germans. And there's no doubt, in retrospect, the main reason he was convicted is because he was the only Jewish officer the French army had in a high rank. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism in France then, as there is now. He was in prison about 2 years when the guy who actually stole the papers and sold them to the Germans confessed to an English newspaper for money. And the French government covered that up for 5 years more, even though they knew who the guilty party was and he had confessed and it had been published in England, because governments have this superstitious thing. If we ever admit we're wrong about anything, people will stop thinking we're infallible, and if people stop thinking governments are infallible, the governments can collapse. So they, like Bush can't admit the truth about the Gulf War.
I was really shocked when I was excited too when I heard Perot's bombshell on the Gillespie papers. That was the first really substantive, for me, when it broke through all the other.
I knew when Perot came back in that it was that the last part of the campaign was going to be the best part, and when he got into the debates, I knew the debates were going to be much more exciting. Generally, the two parties negotiate so that nobody can get seriously hurt in the debates. They set up so many safeguards, and but with Perot there was always the possibility of a sudden explosion, and there were quite a few of them. And Clinton held his own, and Bush looked more and more defensive and guilty, and Bush began to look sick, I think, by the time of the third debate.
Yeah, I thought he looked ill. I think a lot of people seem to have the feeling that in Washington, D.C., the Republicans and Democrats are in this extremely intricate incestuous collusion with each other, that they're not really that much as adversarial as people would like to believe.
Well, I lived in Ireland for 6 years, and one of the ideas, I traveled a lot in Europe, and one of the ideas I came back with was we need more parties. Most European countries have at least 4 parties. In a lot of countries, 2 of them are really strong and the other 2 aren't so strong, but they do get some people into Parliament. And it does give you a more interesting balance. It also encourages more people to vote. In Europe, almost everybody votes because it does make a difference. If you don't like the 2 major parties, you got 2 further choices, and everybody has somebody representing them.